what's held us together as a country is not a race, is not a creed, it's not our geography. It's this notion of the American dream, where everyone can participate, and if you work hard and play by the rules, you can succeed. Increasingly, since the 1980s, that's fallen apart.
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I'm thrilled to have John Driscoll on today. He is a co-producer of the #1 Midas Studios documentary, Against All Enemies. But we're not talking about the end of democracy today. We're talking about John's forthcoming book, Pay the People, Why Fair Pay is Good for Business and Great for America. John, great to have you. Why were you moved to write this book? And let me just preface by saying that the first line of the Amazon description describes you as an unlikely source for this argument.
Well, I think there's an assumption, Ken. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I think there's an assumption that businessmen and CEOs and people who are rabid capitalists are going to be against paying the workers a fair living wage. And I think that has been certainly the media portrayal, and in many cases the reality. And the point of Pay the People is that paying a living wage is an investment in your team and can drive great business results. It's, I think, necessary for a successful social contract that leads to people succeeding around any notion of the American dream. If you are struggling to succeed, you aren't going to believe that you're going to do better than your parents and your kids can do better than you. And finally, relevant to your audience, if people are continuing to run up the down escalator of wages with costs going up, and the minimum wage in 20 states is still $7.25 an hour, $15,000 a year, people are struggling to succeed. So we shouldn't be surprised that that then leads to grievance. And so I come at this as a capitalist, but I think that the reason why I thought it was super important to write the book is because it's also, I think, reestablishing a fair wage is essential to kind of reestablishing a fair society.
Early in the book, you talk about your experience as a business leader with CareCentrix and increasing wages there. Can you talk about that as an example of the cascade effects of providing people with a living wage, and give us a little bit of your background in the process as a, quote, raging capitalist?
Yeah, no, I've had the good fortune to have been an executive at some of the largest and fastest growing companies in America. Companies like Priceline during the internet era, or Oxford Health Plans in the early stages of managed care, or Medco, pharmacy benefit management, and then obviously a senior executive at Walgreens. And so I've got a decent pedigree to say, look, I should have some insight into how business can and should work. About 12 years ago, right after I helped sell Medco and had been a CEO of a software business in Silicon Valley, or president of a Silicon Valley software business, I took over a company called CareCentrix, a healthcare services business that had got into some real trouble, had stopped selling, and had some real customer service problems, and it was a real turnaround. And as CEO, early on, I understood that my workers, largely service workers, paying claims, picking up the phone, solving healthcare problems, were really struggling. And so I froze executive salaries, and this is 12 years ago, more than doubled the entry-level wages to $15 an hour, which effectively impacted more than 30% of the company. And I did it by freezing executive salaries, which have gotten, in general, very, very high, and invested that money into our front line. And what changed in our company, I think would help change society if we could all be all in on making sure people get paid fairly. Because if they're not paid fairly, I don't see how they think that the labor work society deal is going to be in any way fair. And when you don't think that the rules are fair, it's hard to believe you're going to participate without grievance.
Does it depend on altruism? Does it depend on a business leader like you? Because if that's the case, we're screwed, right? Or is there a compelling enough business case that people, and I've known you for a while, John, I have confidence that you in charge of any company would do this, but we can't count on that.
No, but I would point out, well, first of all, I totally agree with you. The federal government, since the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, has taken the position that one set of rules should be established to establish a minimum wage. That's why we have a federal minimum wage. And historically, under Republican and Democratic administrations in the Congress and the House, we've actually continued to raise the minimum wage since 1938. That stopped in the 80s as part of the bipartisan consensus got stuck. I think you have to establish broad rules so that everybody plays by the same rules. We'll get back to that in a second. But that's why, what happens when you don't do that? Let's just chase that down. Is that you have a situation where over 20 million people in America are subsidized, or their jobs are being subsidized. They're paid less than, they're paid at or near a minimum wage level, less than the living wage, which would be about $20 if you pick the median cost of taking care of yourself without any kid. And they're subsidizing food stamps, healthcare benefits, other services. So what happens when you don't pay a living wage is businesses that pay less are being subsidized by the taxpayer. So in addition to the kind of the social stress that creates, and it's genuinely stressful when you can't afford to pay for diapers for your kids, which was the case of some of my employees, or you're living out of a car even with a full-time job, which was true of another one of my employees. The moral argument and the economic argument come together that there should be one set of rules which all companies have to play by.
How did this get so out of whack? There's that, apocryphal rule, I'm sure, that, the highest salaried person in a company shouldn't be paid more than 7 times the lowest salary. And we haven't seen that for a very long time. But that curve began to bend really steeply in the 80s. Like, what happened in that graph to set executive pay on such an insane trajectory compared to the average worker's salary?
Well, I think really two things went sideways. One, there was a sort of a notion that the market would take care, sort of a neoliberal consensus post-Reagan, that the market would adjust and that workers' wages would chase productivity. But that's just not the case. Between 1938 and the mid-1970s, median American worker productivity goes up by about 97%. Median wages go up by 91%. When that consensus comes unwound in the 80s, since the 80s till 2014, median productivity has gone up over 70%. Median wages have gone up 9.1%. So when the government stepped back, the market failed. The other thing that happened is more compensation got tied to stock compensation. And so you literally go from a system where the CEO to average worker ratio is closer to 20 in large corporate America, 20 to 30, to now it is 200, 300x, that where senior executives are earning just absurd amounts of cash in their direct compensation and in stock-based compensation. And I don't begrudge anybody to make a lot of money, but I don't think it's fair if the top's making all the money, shareholders' returns are going through the roof, the Wall Street has reaped those returns, and the average American worker is being left out. That's not fair. Workers understand it. And that, I think, is driving a lot of the grievance and unhappiness that America is not working for working Americans.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here to let you know that we'd love to hear from you. Your comments, suggestions, thoughts about future topics and guests. Email us at info@thekenharbaughshow.com. And make sure to rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks, and back to the show. There's a pro-democracy piece of this argument as well, and it's somewhat buried, but if you're a student of history at all, if you look at what happens to societies in the decades before collapse, it's often wealth inequality that elevates those grievances and creates the kind of resentment that lead to the pitchforks coming out. I mean, that's not the main thesis here, but it's something I certainly worry about when you talk about worker pay stagnating and executive pay going through the roof.
Oh, I think it's a genuine issue. I don't want to live in a country like Brazil, where wealthy people have to have armed guards, armored cars, and very high walls. I want to live in a place like Northern Europe, where things are more equitable and CEOs can live safely in the neighborhoods that their entry level workers are living in. I mean, this is a choice, to your point, Ken. And when people feel like the system doesn't work, I mean, what's held us together as a country is not a race, is not a creed, it's not our geography. It's this notion of the American dream, where everyone can participate, and if you work hard and play by the rules, you can succeed. Increasingly, since the 1980s, that's fallen apart. And what's absurd about the challenge here is we can fix it, and you're actually seeing some of the largest and most successful companies in America start to invest in paying a living wage. What we're talking about in Pay the People is not just why we should do it, but practical examples of why, on the business side, what I did at CareCentrix, what Doug McMillan's doing as the CEO of Walmart, or Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan, why that works so well in those companies. But the less subtle point, Ken, which you're touching on, is if we don't solve this problem, I don't see how we don't get to a point where grievance will continue to grow and people will be even more upset about a system where they're working hard and working 1 and 2 and in some cases 3 jobs, and they just don't feel like they can get ahead.
There is a co-author on the book jacket here, but also an organization behind the book. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we're talking about democracy. And the organization on the front of this book is the Patriotic Millionaires. Can you talk about that group, why they exist, and why collectively you are so concerned about, I guess, wealth distribution in this country?
Well, it's really inequality and opportunity. I mean, when the Bush tax cuts were coming in and people were talking about radically reducing or eliminating the estate tax at a time of extraordinary concentrations of wealth, we were concerned that there was an opportunity to articulate why, as rich, successful Americans, we felt it would be completely fair and legitimate and, in fact, an investment to pay more in taxes. We think that the rich should pay their fair share and that there's nothing more patriotic than investing in your country and investing in the American dream. And there's nothing less patriotic than being selfish and focusing on just tax game and scheme to avoid investing in America. I mean, taxes are the price we pay for freedom.
Are you worried at all in the aftermath of the election about any kind of retribution against business leaders who are deemed insufficiently loyal? And I don't mean locking people up, but I mean the kind of subtle harassment or the harassment from behind a presidential podium that we see in other countries. Is that a concern within groups like Patriotic Millionaires when you talk about the consequences of what just happened?
I think you always have to worry about the political reaction when you've got people in office and politics who've extended the rules of what, or the conventional rules of what's appropriate behavior. But I mean, our country has survived worse. We've had people, when FDR was elected, threatened to organize a coup d'etat. Certainly, business during the Johnson era and the Kennedy era were very concerned. This country has tolerated extremes of opinion. What I think we're very focused on is making sure that when people start to think about capitalists and millionaires and success, that's not only associated with the far right. That's not only associated with people who want to reduce taxes, that there's a legitimate and fair argument that rich people should be paying more and that rich people can make that argument. That we're in this together as Americans. And as Team America, we should pay more, the rich should pay more in taxes, and companies can pay more to make sure that they're paying a living wage. That in the same way that we all believe in the American dream, let's invest in it.
I think that is a beautiful note to end on, John. We are indeed all in this together. Thanks so much for coming on.
And thanks so much for having me. And make sure that you remind your viewers that Pay the People comes out on December 3rd.
December 3rd, we'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Ken.